I'm paying that tariff because my importer, John Deere, paid it. They paid it directly to the Treasury. Now the President of the United States is going to take my money and give it back to me and call it a bailout. That's just comical.
As President Trump shifts his focus to affordability, he has announced a lifeline for American farmers who've been hurt directly by his trade policies. The president now planning to use revenue from tariffs to pay for a $12 billion bailout for farmers. The White House says it will provide much needed relief for farmers as they get this year's harvest to market and look ahead to next year.
Just that we're caught in right now, and this is all I know. Can't do it any better.
Incredibly heartbreaking. Let's bring in CBS News correspondent Lana Zak, who's joining me now from Iowa City, where many farmers are sadly feeling the pinch. That gentleman you were speaking to there, Lana, you can just hear and see how devastating all of this has been for him.
What we need now is market-based solutions to give us opportunity to increase demand, both domestically and abroad. We have great opportunities now with biofuels that the administration could help with here in the short term that would give us a boost, renewing the renewable volume obligations. All they lack is final approval from the administration and final approval of the 45Z tax credit. That would help us immediately with biofuels here at home.
Georgia's #1 industry, which is agriculture, is getting a major federal boost. The Trump administration has announced a $12 billion farm aid package Georgia leaders say could help stabilize farms. But critics argue the plan leaves too many other farmers behind. Atlanta News First reporter Abby Caceres explains what all this means for families across the state.
This is being framed as a lifeline for farm families. But farmers I spoke with wouldn't go on camera. They say they're still unsure how to feel as uncertainty still hangs over the industry.
And we need market-based solutions. As I said earlier, we need the market to have strong demand, both domestically and abroad.
America was told this would make it stronger. Instead, it broke something it still hasn't fixed. When sweeping tariffs were launched, the headlines focused on global rivals, steel, and high-stakes politics. But far from Washington, something else was happening quietly, brutally, and with consequences that still haven't faded. U.S. farmers were being crushed, markets vanished, prices collapsed. And even after the government rushed in with $12 billion in aid, the damage didn't stop. This isn't a story about politics, it's a story about livelihoods and why the bill is still coming due. When the tariffs were announced, many American farmers didn't panic. At first, they trusted the message coming from Washington that this was a short-term sacrifice for a long-term win. They were told new trade deals would replace lost markets. They were told the pain would be temporary, and they were told help would come if things went wrong. What they weren't told was how fast everything would unravel. Within weeks, foreign buyers began pulling back. Long-standing trade relationships built carefully over decades froze. Almost overnight. For farmers, especially those producing soybeans, corn, pork, and dairy, the shock was immediate. Prices didn't slide gradually, they collapsed. Soybeans tell the clearest story. Before the trade war, China was the largest buyer of U.S. soybeans. Entire regions of the Midwest were built around that demand. Equipment purchases, land leases, bank loans, everything assumed those exports would continue. When retaliatory tariffs hit, those buyers vanished. Silence replaced certainty. Grain elevators filled up, storage bins overflowed, crops meant for overseas markets sat idle, losing value by the day. Farmers watched futures prices sink below the cost of production, knowing that every harvested acre was locking in a loss. This wasn't just a bad season, it was a systemic shock. Farmers operate on razor-thin margins. A few cents per bushel can determine whether a year ends in profit or debt. The tariffs didn't shave off cents, they erased entire margins. For many operations, especially family farms, survival suddenly depended on credit. Banks noticed immediately. Loan restructurings surged. Credit tightened. Some lenders refused to renew operating loans without additional collateral. For farmers whose wealth was tied up in land and machinery, that meant one thing: risk was no longer theoretical, it was personal. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Extreme weather was already pressuring agriculture. Floods, droughts, and unpredictable seasons had driven costs higher. The trade shock landed on top of that strain, turning stress into crisis. Washington responded with money. A $12 billion aid package was announced, later expanded, designed to stabilize farm income. On paper, it sounded massive. In reality, it acted like a temporary patch on a structural wound. Payments arrived late, they were uneven, and they couldn't replace lost markets. Aid checks helped farmers survive the moment, but they did nothing to rebuild broken trade relationships. Once global buyers adjusted, they didn't rush back. Brazil expanded production. Other exporters filled the gap. Supply chains shifted. That shift is what made the damage lasting. Trade isn't just about price, it's about trust and reliability. When the U.S. became an unpredictable supplier, importers reduced risk by diversifying away. Even after tariffs ceased, many buyers already had new partners. American farmers were left competing in a market that no longer depended on them the same way. The emotional toll was severe. Farm bankruptcies rose. Stress-related health issues increased. Rural communities already fragile felt the effects spread outward. Equipment dealers, transport firms, and local businesses suffered alongside. Farmers. This wasn't a single industry taking a hit, it was an entire ecosystem unraveling, yet the national conversation stayed focused elsewhere. The trade war was framed as a strategic contest between global powers. Wins and losses were debated in abstract terms. Meanwhile, farmers were selling equipment, delaying retirement, and watching. Land passed down through generations edged toward foreclosure. What made the pain worse was uncertainty. Farmers can endure hardship when there is a clear end. What they struggled with was not knowing whether markets would ever return or whether they were rebuilding their lives around an industry that had permanently shifted against them. By the time aid programs expanded, many farms were already gone. Others survived but weakened, more indebted, more cautious. The tariffs didn't just reduce income, they changed behavior. Farmers delayed investments, cut back production, and avoided risk not because demand disappeared, but because predictability did. That hesitation still lingers. And this is only the beginning of the story. Because the true consequences of the trade war weren't fully felt when the policies were announced, but in the years that followed, as American agriculture discovered that some losses don't disappear when the rules change. The damage to U.S. farmers didn't end when markets disappeared. That was only the first phase. What followed was quieter, more strategic, and far more consequential because while American producers were waiting for trade relationships to recover, the global market didn't wait with them. It adapted. China, facing immediate supply pressure, after tariffs reshaped trade flows, moved fast. Food security is not optional for a country of more than 1 billion people. When a major supplier becomes unreliable, ideology doesn't matter, stability does. So procurement strategies changed, not temporarily, structurally. Instead of depending on one dominant supplier, China accelerated a diversification plan that had existed for years but had never been executed at full scale. And Africa moved from the margins of that plan to the center of it. This wasn't charity, it was leverage. Across multiple African countries, agricultural production was already expanding. Land availability, labor, and improving infrastructure made the continent an attractive alternative, especially for soybeans, grains, and animal feed. The trade war didn't create Africa's rise, it accelerated it. Chinese buyers who once signed long-term contracts with U.S. exporters began locking in deals elsewhere. Investments flowed not just into purchasing crops, but into logistics, ports, storage facilities, rail links, processing plants. This is the part often missed in public debates. Trade isn't just about buying commodities, it's about building systems that make switching suppliers permanent. And that's exactly what happened. Brazil is often mentioned as the immediate beneficiary of the shift away from U.S. agriculture, and it was. But Africa represented something different. Not just an alternative supplier, but a long-term strategic partner. Unlike traditional exporters, many African producers were willing to align production directly with Chinese demand. Crops were grown to specification, harvest timelines were adjusted, entire value chains were optimized for one buyer. That level of coordination is hard to reverse. While American farmers were waiting for tariff relief, China was securing supply certainty elsewhere, and certainty beats familiarity every time. By the time trade tensions eased, Chinese buyers weren't scrambling to return. They already had contracts, they already had infrastructure, they already had political and economic ties reinforced by years of cooperation. From a purely strategic perspective, there was no reason to go back. This is where the consequences became irreversible. Global commodity markets don't reset when policy changes, once supply chains move, they calcify. Capital investment follows stability, not nostalgia. American farmers weren't just competing on price anymore. They were competing against systems built to exclude them. Africa's role in this shift wasn't accidental. For decades, African agriculture had been underdeveloped relative to its potential. The trade war created a rare opening and opportunity to step into a gap left by a disrupted giant. Governments responded. Export frameworks were modernized, partnerships deepened, regional trade corridors improved. In some cases, entire agricultural strategies were rewritten to target Asian demand. This wasn't a short-term windfall, it was a structural realignment, and while U.S. policymakers debated compensation packages, other regions were building permanence. This is why the $12 billion aid package failed to reverse the damage. Money can cover losses, it cannot restore relevance. Aid payments helped farmers survive a season or two, but they didn't rebuild leverage in a global market that had moved on. They didn't create new buyers. They didn't undo years of investment made elsewhere. Most critically, they didn't address the trust deficit. From the perspective of global importers, the lesson was clear. Political volatility in one country could disrupt supply overnight. Diversification wasn't optional anymore, it was essential. That lesson didn't fade when tariffs did. It hardened, for American farmers. This created a new reality. Even when prices recovered somewhat, market access didn't. Export volumes failed to return to previous peaks. Margins stayed tighter. Competition intensified, and the psychological impact was profound. Farmers weren't just producing crops anymore, they were producing into uncertainty. Should they expand acreage? Should they invest in new equipment? Should they take on more debt? When your largest buyer can disappear due to policy overnight, every decision becomes a gamble. This hesitation rippled outward. Younger generations reconsidered staying in agriculture. Succession plans collapsed. Consolidation accelerated as smaller farms sold out to larger operations that could absorb volatility. The trade war didn't just shift exports, it reshaped the structure of American farming itself. Meanwhile, Africa's role continued to grow. As Chinese demand stabilized African production, investment confidence increased that attracted secondary buyers. Other Asian markets followed. Europe adjusted sourcing strategies. Africa was no longer just filling a gap, it was becoming embedded in global food security planning. This is the point where the narrative fully flips. What began as a domestic policy decision ended up redistributing global agricultural power. And once power shifts, it rarely returns without force. American farmers weren't defeated by competition alone, they were sidelined by a system that adapted faster than policy could respond. The trade war was framed as a negotiation tactic. In reality, it functioned like a catalyst triggering long-delayed changes in global supply chains. That would have happened eventually, but not this fast. Speed is what made the difference. Speed favored those ready to absorb opportunity. Africa was ready, and China was decisive. By the time Washington realized markets had been replaced, not paused, the damage was already locked in. This is why recovery has been so uneven. It's not about tariffs anymore, it's about position. And position, once lost, is brutally hard to reclaim. In the final act, we'll confront the question many avoid, whether American agriculture can regain its former dominance or whether this moment marked the beginning of a permanent global reordering, because the real cost of the trade war wasn't paid in aid dollars, it was paid in influence. By the time the trade disruption settled, one fact was undeniable. Global agricultural dynamics had shifted. China had secured alternative sources, Africa had stepped into the gap, and U.S. farmers were no longer the default supplier. The $12 billion aid package had alleviated immediate pain, but it could not restore lost influence or guarantee market access. Attempts to reclaim buyers faced structural obstacles. Supply chains had adapted, contracts were long-term, investments in African infrastructure from ports to processing facilities had locked in advantages that the U.S. could no longer match overnight. Recovery wasn't just a matter of producing crops, it required regaining trust, rebuilding relationships, and competing with suppliers who were already embedded in new systems. For American farmers, this meant a new era of uncertainty. Expansion decisions, debt management, and investment planning now carried the weight of permanent global shifts. Communities once reliant on predictable trade flows faced consolidation, delayed growth, and in some cases, the loss of family farms. The past security of a guaranteed buyer was gone. Adaptation, innovation, and strategic partnerships would define survival. And yet, there is opportunity hidden within crisis. Some producers pivoted, diversifying crops, exploring regional markets, or investing in niche exports. But for most, the lesson was stark. In a globalized world, market dominance is fleeting, and political shifts can instantly redraw the map. The era of complacency was over. This isn't just a story about tariffs or aid checks. It's a story about power, timing, and adaptation. When markets shift, money alone cannot restore influence. Trust, infrastructure, and strategic foresight determine who benefits and who falls behind. The U.S. lost more than crops. It lost leverage. China gained alternatives. Africa gained prominence. And once global systems adapt, old players rarely reclaim their position without deliberate, long-term strategy. The question now is simple. Will U.S. agriculture adjust to this new reality or continue hoping for a return to the past? Because in the global economy, the cost of inaction isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in lost influence, lost markets, and lost generations of farmers. And for those watching closely, one warning is clear: the world won't wait, neither should you.